Hi there everyone and welcome to this Get Strumming special where I'm going to talk about George Harrison and his love of the ukulele. Right, before I begin, if there's anybody out there who doesn't know who George Harrison was, he was a member of the Beatles, the biggest band to ever grace this planet. And I would say that because I'm biased, they're my favourite band. But George Harrison was not only the lead guitarist of the band, but the learning curve that that guy had from when he got signed in 1962 to when they split up in 1970 was like this. I mean, it was vertical. The guy picked up so much from John and Paul, and he grafted away at his craft to become a superb songwriter. I mean, the songs that he was coming out with in the early 60s, I think were great enough to rival a lot of the other artists that were out at the time. But by 1968, it was coming out with stuff like While My Guitar Gently Weeps, Something, which was one of Frank Sinatra's favourite Lennon and McCartney songs. He didn't realise that it was George Harrison that wrote it. And Here Comes the Sun. And even recently, Here Comes the Sun has been voted on iTunes as the top Beatles song. So finally, 50 years later, George Harrison is getting the recognition that he really deserves. And also, Paul McCartney recently mentioned in an interview that it was George that came along and provided the hook to one of Paul's songs to make it a hit. And the song was And I Love Her on A Hard Day's Night. So just providing those four notes gave the song exactly what it needed. It was that magic ingredient. Now, when George started off playing in the Beatles, he was doing a lot of Chet Atkins and Carl Perkins style fingerpicking. That kind of thing. And then when he got to the late 60s, he was really taking a lot of inspiration from Eric Clapton, who obviously George was a big fan of, and in fact Eric Clapton ended up getting married to George's wife. But George picked up a hell of a lot from Eric Clapton, and then in the 1970s George became this massive slide guitar player, and I think it was on Belinda Carlisle's song Leave the Light On in the mid 80s, I think it was, and George Harrison provided the slide guitar solo there. In fact, he's even said that that was his own personal favourites of his guitar solos. So he was an absolutely brilliant guitarist for the Beatles, and in the 1970s and onwards in his solo years he became an absolutely astonishing slide guitarist. But what a lot of people don't realise is he also became a massive ukulele fan. Now don't forget, George was known to be the quiet Beatle. He was the one that was always kind of stood at the back and let Lennon and McCartney have kind of the front seat when it came to interviews. But George was more than capable of dishing out the odd dry comment, and he was also great at providing the band with different avenues to follow. For example, it was George that came up with the Indian influence, like on Revolver with Love You Too, and on Sgt. Pepper with Within You and Without You, which were two great songs which were incorporating Eastern influences into Western popular culture. So he was a really innovative guy. But when the ukulele came along, that wasn't until the late 1980s. Now don't forget, George had a great sense of humour. He was a massive Spike Milligan fan, Peter Sellers and Monty Python. He even remortgaged his house so that he could pay for Monty Python to make A Life of Brian. So his influences were not only in the musical field, but in a whole different area of arts, including films. And it was through his love of films that he got into playing the ukulele, because in the 1980s he rediscovered his love for George Formby. Now, for those of you that don't know who George Formby was, George Formby was a star of the big screen in the 1930s and 1940s. He was an actor, comedian, musician, and in fact it was his dad who's the big star of the music hall and vaudeville, and George Formby Jr. thought, oh, I want to have a go at that, but this was against his dad's wishes, and originally George Formby Jr. Was a jockey, but he decided to follow into his father's footsteps and learnt the banjolele, and came out with all these fantastic songs. And it's easy to see why George Harrison would have found this really appealing, because for a start he was born in Wigan, which was only about 20 miles away from Liverpool, and the fact that have shared the same northern sense of humour and this love of music would have been a double whammy for George, and he'd have really embraced that old humour and musicianship from George Formby, and it's easy to see why. Here's one of George Formby's songs. Now I go cleaning windows to earn an honest bob. For an Ozzy Parker, it's an interesting job. Now it's a job that just suits me. A window cleaner you would be if you could see what I could see when I'm cleaning windows. It wasn't long after George rediscovered George Formby's black and white movies that he took up the ukulele and started learning George Formby's back catalogue, all the obscure songs, everything. Don't forget, when George Harrison put his mind to something, whether it be Indian music, slide guitar, or even the film industry, he would absolutely immerse himself in that topic and learn it inside out, and that's exactly what he did with the ukulele. In fact, so much so, he ended up joining the George Formby Appreciation Society in Blackpool, and he took his son Dhani along, so both of them are going up to Blackpool with their ukuleles, and the thrill that they must have had at the convention when all of a sudden a Beatle and his son turns up to play some songs. And it's important to mention that George actually got up on stage to play a song, because everybody has their own little party piece. George played a song called In My Little Snapshot Album, but he said to the audience that there's a little bit in here, I'm only starting. It was always really self-deprecating and modest. And he said, oh, I'm just learning the ukulele, but there's a little solo bit here that I find difficult, and I don't know if I can remember all the words. So he started playing the song, and when he got stuck with the words, the entire crowd helped him out, and it was such a joyous experience. And so yeah, George absolutely loved taking part in the George Formby conventions, and did do right up until he got ill with cancer. And he actually befriended one of the members called Ray Bernard, and Ray spent an evening chatting to George, because George wanted his ukulele fixing. So Ray said, oh, don't worry, I'll sort it out. And they spent till 2 in the morning chatting about all things ukulele. And eventually Olivia, George's wife, bought one of Ray Bernard's ukuleles off him for George. And then later on, George actually gave that ukulele to Paul McCartney. Now, although the Beatles didn't really use the ukulele throughout the 1960s, when it came to the release of their 1995 reunion single, Free as a Bird, you can hear George in all his ukulele playing splendour, playing the last few bars of When I'm Cleaning Windows. And also at the end of the track you can hear a recording that had been reversed of John Lennon saying, "Turn out nice again," which is actually George Formby's catchphrase. But the fact that the recording was reversed makes it sound as though John was saying, "Made by John Lennon." And with regards to the video of Free as a Bird, the video's director, Joe Pitka, said that George actually approached him with a view to playing the guy who stands on the stage playing the ukulele over George's bit that he recorded on the track. But Joe Pitka said to George, look, the problem is that we've got no footage of the Beatles as they are today, and all the footage was actually stock footage from the 1960s. So if we were to include you, George, we'd need to include John and Paul as well to make it fair. So George wasn't included in the video. And this is a decision that Joe Pitka really regrets now, because after George's passing, it had been great to have him there on the stage playing the ukulele as the George Formby character. And also Joe didn't realise that it was actually George playing the ukulele at the end of the track on the recording. Now, not only was George a massive ukulele fan, but also his friends were, two of which include Joe Brown of Joe Brown and the Brothers, who was a massive star back in the 1960s, and also the sadly departed Neil Innes, who was a member of the Bonzo Dog Doodah band, both of which I had the pleasure to meet, and both of which signed my ukulele. Here's Joe Brown and Neil Innes, and I managed to get to see Neil Innes, sadly just a few months before he passed away, when he played with the Ruttles, which is a Beatles parody band. So if you ever get a chance to see any of their footage on YouTube, or if you get to see Joe Brown live, I really recommend it. Now, one of the reasons that Joe Brown became friends with George in the first place was their shared love of the ukulele. In fact, George actually was best man at Joe's wedding. Joe had this to say about George and the ukulele. You can pick up a ukulele and anybody can learn to play a couple of tunes in a day or even a few hours. And if you want to get good at it, there's no end to what you can do. And with regards to George, he loved music. Not just rock and roll, he'd go crackers. He'd phone me up and say, "I've got this great record." And it'd be Hoagie Carmichael and all this Hawaiian stuff he used to like. George was definitely not a musical snob. In 2002, a tribute concert was held in memory of George at the Royal Albert Hall in London. It included a whole host of George's musician friends throughout the years, including Ravi Shankar, Tom Petty, Jeff Lynne from ELO, the Monty Python team, Paul McCartney, Ringo Starr, Eric Clapton, and of course Joe Brown. Joe included 3 songs throughout the evening, including George's That's the Way It Goes, Here Comes the Sun, and this 1924 song by Gus Kahn and Isham Jones called I'll See You in My Dreams. I'll see you in my dreams, hold you in my dreams. Now the next question is, which ukulele brands did George prefer? Well, as you can imagine, George will have had quite a few ukuleles in his artillery. In fact, Dhani, his son, actually was reported to say that when they used to take an airplane trip anywhere, George would carry 2 ukes in his hand luggage. One was for him and the other one was for anybody else who might play the ukulele, who would want to join him with a bit of a jam. And once on a business trip, George would get out his ukulele and play to all the passengers, which must have been incredible. But as for ukuleles that George actually preferred, he used to have a Martin, he had a Gibson that apparently he gave to Paul McCartney, and he used to favour the Hawaiian brand Nahiku, and he also enjoyed playing Ludwig banjoleles. Now, a banjolele is actually a brand name, but a banjo uke, to use the correct terminology, is like it has the neck of a ukulele and the body of a banjo, and they were really useful for music hall performers because of the reverberation within the body of the uke used to project all the way to the back of the music hall, so they were really well heard. This was in the days before microphones and where you could plug your instruments in. George also had another ukulele that actually belonged to George Formby, and he had this for years and cherished it, and then eventually before his death he gifted it to the George Formby Appreciation Society. In 2008 they sold it to the guy who owns the Beatles exhibition in Liverpool, and they held on to it till 2015, and then it was sold for a staggering £28,500. So George obviously had a load of ukuleles, but some that he held particularly dear. As Joe Brown said, the Beatles were certainly no musical snobs, and they weren't afraid to dig deep within the musical heritage. For example, John Lennon actually learnt the banjo chords from his mother, Julia, and it took Paul McCartney to say, no, these are actually guitar chords that you need to play. And also they had a lot of influences like the old jazz standards from the 20s. Don't forget Paul McCartney's dad, James McCartney, had his own band, the Jim Mac Jazz Band. They also had influences like Fred Astaire, Noel Coward, and obviously later on they had the contemporaries, so they had rock and roll, soul and Motown. Then in the mid-60s you had the avant-garde influences like Stockhausen. George obviously brought in the Indian influences like Ravi Shankar, and also Jimi Hendrix also had a lot of influence in their later stuff, not to mention obviously the blues musicians that were around the time like Eric Clapton. So let's have a look at another song that George played. Now this song was recorded by George in 1992 with Joe Brown and also Jules Holland and Ray Cooper, the percussionist, amongst many other people. And it was a song from the 20s that was first performed by Cab Calloway, and this is Between the Devil and the Deep Blue Sea. Now, for anybody that's actually seen the footage of George playing Between the Devil and the Deep Blue Sea on YouTube, is using a baritone uke, and it goes like this. I don't want you, but I hate to lose you. You got me in between the devil and the deep blue sea. Now, although there's not actually that much footage of George playing the ukulele on the internet, what is up there is really worth looking for, including some footage taken in 1994 as part of the Beatles anthology, and it was filmed in George's garden in Henley-on-Thames at Friar Park, and Paul, George and Ringo all sat there on the lawn, beautiful summer's day, and they're reminiscing, and Paul and George have got the ukuleles and they play through stuff like Ain't She Sweet? Oh, ain't she sweet? We'll see you walking down that street. We'll ask you very confidentially, ain't she sweet? Then George plays through a little snippet of Paul's I Will. Then George also gives us a treat by playing one of his unreleased songs that he wrote in Rishikesh in 1968, and it's called Dehradun, and it goes like this. Dehradun, 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 Dehradun. Many a roads will take you there, many a different way. One direction takes you years, another takes you days. Now, another bit of footage worth looking for is when Paul pays tribute to George at his live concerts, and he's actually using the ukulele that George gave him. So as you can imagine, it's a pretty emotional thing for Paul to do. And he often tells the anecdote of when he used to go around to George's, and they'd have a meal and everything, and then later on in the evening the ukuleles would come out, and then they'd jam and play songs to each other. And Paul actually said to George, I've got a song here that you might know. And it goes like this. Something in the way she moves attracts me like no other lover. Something in the way she woos me. I don't wanna leave her now. You know I believe in how. Then George would chime in and say, no, that's not how it goes. It should go, something in the way she moves, and then go into a George Formby version. In actual fact, there's some footage of George and Jeff Lynne playing banjoleles, and somebody's also playing spoons, and they go into a kind of George Formby version. So that's also really worth looking for as well. So George Harrison, Lynne, banjo, ukulele. Another recommendation I can give is George's last album, which is called Brainwashed. Now this album was released about a year after he passed away, and he'd recorded a handful of demos and left instructions to Lynne and his son Dhani on how he would like these songs completing. So Jeff and Dhani got together in the studio and put together a lot of extra harmonies and extra instruments just to embellish it and give it a fuller and richer texture. Now the opening track to this album is an absolute beauty. In fact, it's one of my favourite George songs. It's called Any Road. I've been travelling on a boat and a plane, on a car and a bike, with a bus and a train, travelling near, everywhere, in every gear. But oh Lord, we pay the price with the spin of the wheel, with the roll of the dice. Ah yeah, you pay your fare, and if you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there. I think the most wonderful thing about George and his love and involvement with the ukulele was how it brought him and Dhani together. And Dhani's actually said what a wonderful instrument the ukulele was for a kid, because let's face it, there are only 4 strings to worry about. And also how he'd see George wandering around the house with a ukulele just playing the most bizarre songs like Barnacle Bill the Sailor. It's only me from over the sea, it's Barnacle Bill the Sailor. All lit up like a Christmas tree, I'm Barnacle Bill the Sailor. And I myself have noticed how the ukulele has brought together people of all generations. So in a room you might have 5-year-olds playing alongside 92-year-olds, and it's such a cohesive instrument, and an instrument that really does bring people together. But as for the last word, I'm going to leave that with George. Everybody should have and play a uke. It's so simple to carry with you, and it is one instrument you can't play and not laugh. It's so sweet and also very old. Some are made of wood, some are made of armadillos. I love them, the more the merrier. Everyone I know who's into the ukulele is crackers, so get yourself a few and enjoy yourselves. And you know what? I couldn't agree more, George. Thanks very much for joining me, and also, if you like this picture of George here that I've got, the artist is from West Yorkshire and he's called James Armitage, so check him out. Thanks very much for joining me, and all the best.